A wall of mud and debris tore through the Arizona desert today. Some folks had to jump out of its path and barely escape.
New footage from the Oregon-California border reveals an aftermath nobody predicted. And the moment fisheries biologists hit play on this underwater camera clip, the room went completely silent. Not because of what it showed, because of what it meant. We all thought we knew how this story was going to end. Engineers spend $500 million blowing up 4 dams. The river turns to sludge. The salmon that were supposed to come back never do. That's the story skeptics told for 2 decades. We have all heard some version of it. But this footage was shot last fall, deep in a tributary that had been sealed off from the rest of the Klamath River for over a century. And what it captured is something that 20 years of court battles, environmental review, and the largest dam removal project in American history was never guaranteed to produce. Something has shifted inside that river. Something that not even the scientists who fought for this project for 2 decades were certain they would live to see. The people watching this footage are not celebrating. They are not panicking either. They are doing something far more unsettling. They are asking a question nobody has a real answer to yet. The Klamath was not just a river. That is the first thing people get wrong. It was the 3rd largest salmon-producing river system on the entire west coast of the United States, a 400-mile artery running from the high desert plateaus of southern Oregon down through the mountains of northern California to the Pacific. For thousands of years, it carried some of the largest Chinook salmon runs in the country, along with coho, steelhead, and Pacific lamprey, feeding not just wildlife, but entire tribal nations, who had lived on its banks since long before anyone thought to draw a border between 2 states. The Yurok, the Karuk, the Hoopa Valley tribe, and the Klamath tribes built their entire way of life around this river. Salmon was not a resource to them, it was a relative. Ceremonies, diets, economies, identities, all of it ran on the assumption that the fish would return every single year, the way they always had. Runs so large that early settlers described the river as boiling with fish during peak migration. Chinook salmon weighing 40-50 pounds pushing upstream by the tens of thousands. Coho salmon following behind them. Steelhead trout, Pacific lamprey, an ancient, eel-like fish that predates the dinosaurs, harvested by tribal families for generations off the same rocky ledges their grandparents had fished. The entire basin ran on a rhythm that had held steady since long before written history. And they did. For thousands of years, they did. Then, in the early 20th century, a private power company looked at the Klamath and saw something else entirely. Not a river, a resource waiting to be harnessed. Construction began on Copco 1 in 1918, a concrete dam rising in the middle of salmon country to generate hydroelectric power for the growing towns of the Pacific Northwest. It worked exactly as designed. Electricity flowed to homes and farms across the region. Nobody stopped to ask what would happen to the fish. Here's the catch. Copco 1 wasn't built with a fish ladder. Neither were the 3 dams that followed. Copco 2 added nearby to squeeze more power from the same stretch of river. Iron Gate, completed in 1962, the largest and southernmost of the 4. And J.C. Boyle further upstream in Oregon. 4 concrete walls, one after another, transforming a free-flowing river into a series of stagnant reservoirs. And what that meant, in practical terms, was total. 400 miles of historic salmon-spawning habitat, gone. Not reduced. Sealed off. Fish that had swum upstream for millennia to spawn in the cool headwaters now hit a wall of concrete and simply could not go any further. An entire migratory nation, cut off from the upper 90% of its own homeland. For decades, almost nobody outside the basin noticed. The dams kept generating power. The reservoirs looked, to most observers, like lakes. Peaceful, permanent. What those reservoirs were actually doing, out of sight, was quietly poisoning the river from the inside. Because a river that isn't allowed to move starts to rot. The reservoirs behind the dams sat still under the California sun for months at a time, warming far past what salmon can tolerate. Nutrients that should have flushed downstream and out to sea instead pooled and stagnated, feeding thick blooms of toxic blue-green algae that spread across the water's surface every summer. And in the slow, warm mud that built up behind the concrete, a parasite found paradise. Its name is Ceratodonova shasta. It doesn't look like much under a microscope, a single-celled organism smaller than anything you could ever see with your own eyes. But it needs two hosts to complete its life cycle, and the still, sediment-choked water behind the dams turned out to be perfect breeding ground for the worm that carries it. Juvenile salmon migrating downstream through those reservoirs picked up spores by the thousands. In some years, infection rates in outmigrating young salmon climbed above 90%. The fish that survived the dams were being killed by something the dams themselves had created. And then, in September of 2002, everything that had been building quietly for decades erupted all at once, in the open, where the entire country could see it. Low water levels, high temperatures, and a return run of tens of thousands of adult salmon converged in the lower Klamath River at exactly the wrong moment. The fish, packed into water that was too warm and too shallow, began dying by the thousands. Estimates of the total kill ranged from over 30,000 to as many as 70,000 adult salmon, rotting in the shallows within a matter of days. Tribal members who had fished that river their entire lives walked the banks and found carcasses stacked in the current, faster than anyone could count them. Here's where it gets truly dark. The 2002 fish kill wasn't a freak accident. Scientists studying the disaster afterward traced it directly back to water management decisions made to benefit irrigation upstream, decisions made possible by a river system that the dams had already broken. The Klamath wasn't functioning as an ecosystem anymore, it was functioning as infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it fails, doesn't fail quietly. For the tribes who depend on this river, the 2002 kill was the moment the abstract argument became personal and undeniable. This wasn't a debate about hydrology anymore, it was a river dying in front of them. And get this. The company that owned the dams by this point, PacifiCorp, was not looking to hold on to them out of spite. When the dam's federal operating license came up for renewal in 2006, regulators required something PacifiCorp had never had to provide before: functioning fish passage at all 4 dams, built to modern environmental standards. The company ran the numbers and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Retrofitting 4 aging dams with fish ladders and screens would cost more than the dams generated in power. It would be cheaper to tear them down than to fix them. That set off 2 decades of negotiation, lawsuits, environmental review, and political fighting across 2 states. Tribal nations who had been pushing for this outcome since before the 2002 fish kill finally had leverage they had never held before, and they used every bit of it. Formal removal agreements were signed in 2010, then renegotiated, then challenged, then signed again in 2016, as states, the federal government, and PacifiCorp worked out who would pay for what was about to become the largest dam removal project in the history of the United States. And here's the deal. Even once everyone agreed the dams should come down, almost nobody agreed on how, or believed it could actually be done, without making everything worse. Because behind those 4 dams sat an estimated 15 to 20 million cubic yards of accumulated sediment, more than a century of silt, organic matter, and toxic algae residue that had never once been flushed downstream. Critics pointed to an earlier dam removal on Washington's White Salmon River, where engineers had underestimated the sediment load by nearly 3 times what they predicted. If the Klamath sediment estimate was wrong by even a fraction of that margin, opponents warned, the released mud wouldn't restore the river. It would suffocate it. One congressman called it a project that could kill every living fish, invertebrate, and plant for years to come. Ranchers and residents around the reservoirs said their community was about to be sacrificed for an experiment. The internet, when the demolition finally began, was not gentle. People called it reckless. They called it a $500 million disaster in slow motion. And for a while, the early evidence seemed to prove them right. When crews began draining the reservoirs in January of 2024, decades of trapped sediment surged downstream all at once. Dissolved oxygen levels crashed. Residents documented dead fish and stranded animals along the banks. A doe and her yearling found stuck in the mud, unable to reach open water. Siskiyou County declared a local emergency over water quality. Photos circulated online showing thick brown sludge coating the riverbed for miles. For a moment, it looked exactly like what the skeptics had promised, a river being killed, not saved, by the people who claimed to be restoring it. Scientists on the ground gave a very different explanation, and it is the same explanation river restoration experts have given after nearly every major dam removal in history. This wasn't collapse. It was the river finally being allowed to do the one thing a century of concrete had prevented it from doing, cleaning itself out. A century of trapped decay, flushed downstream in months instead of never. Painful to watch, necessary to survive. By August of 2024, the last of the 4 dams was gone. All of it. Copco 1, Copco 2, J.C. Boyle, and finally Iron Gate, the largest and last to fall. 400 miles of the Klamath River were running free for the first time in over a century. Nobody knew, with any certainty, what would happen next. Here's where the story turns into something almost nobody predicted, and it happened faster than even the most optimistic biologists on the project were willing to say out loud beforehand. Within weeks of the final dam coming down, Chinook salmon began showing up in water none of them had ever swum in before. By that fall, biologists were documenting salmon spawning in tributaries inside the footprint of the former reservoirs, water that had been buried under a lake for 100 years. The following year, in the fall of 2025, salmon were filmed crossing Kino Dam far upstream in Oregon, the first time salmon had been recorded that far north in the system in more than a century. 2 fish, caught on a single camera, quietly rewriting what biologists thought this river was still capable of. And get this, when the official count came in for the 2025 season, nearly 40,000 adult Chinook returned to spawn naturally in the Klamath and its tributaries, more than double what fishery managers had predicted before the season began. Combined with hatchery returns, close to 70,000 fish came home to a river system that 2 years earlier had been sealed shut by concrete. In one newly reopened creek alone, biologists counted roughly 65,000 wild juvenile Chinook, born in water their ancestors hadn't touched since before the dams existed. If you want to see where this goes, subscribe now, because what happens next in this story isn't a clean victory either. The invisible threat that built up behind those dams for a century didn't just disappear when the concrete came down, it moved. Here's where it gets dark in a way that's easy to miss underneath the celebration. Ceratonova shasta, the parasite that thrived in the warm, stagnant reservoirs for decades, is still in this river. Removing the dams didn't remove the parasite. It removed the wall that used to keep it contained to the lower basin. Scientists monitoring water quality after the removal have confirmed that infection rates in outmigrating juvenile salmon remain a serious concern, and with the barrier gone, there is now nothing stopping that parasite from spreading upstream into water that has been parasite-free for 100 years, exactly the water the salmon are now racing to reclaim. The dams are gone. The disease they incubated is not. And the sediment fight isn't over either. Critics who predicted catastrophe point to real, documented harm: fish kills during the initial drawdown, turbidity spikes, a community around the former Copco reservoir that lost its lake and its property values overnight. Restoration scientists counter that these were transitional costs, the price of undoing a century of damage in a handful of years instead of never undoing it at all. Both things, the die-offs and the record salmon returns, are true at the same time. This is not a story with a finish line. It's a story still being written in real time, one field season at a time. Here's the deal. 2 dams still remain on this river system: Kino Dam and the Link River Dam, far upstream near Klamath Falls, both still standing, both without functioning fish passage, built for large-scale salmon migration. The Chinook that were filmed crossing Kino's fish ladder last fall were a preview, not a resolution. Above those final two structures lies Upper Klamath Lake, the historic heart of this salmon run, habitat that hasn't held a spawning Chinook in more than 100 years. Whether salmon ever reach that lake again depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. Then there's the question almost nobody outside the basin is asking yet. What fills the space the dams left behind? 2,200 acres of former reservoir bed are now being replanted, hand-seeded and hydro-seeded, with native grasses, willows, and oak by restoration crews racing against invasive species that move faster than native vegetation ever does. Left unmanaged, that exposed lakebed doesn't just sit empty waiting for the ecosystem to reassemble itself. It becomes an open door for whatever species gets there first, and the newly warmed, sediment-rich margins of a river, still stabilizing, are exactly the kind of disturbed habitat invasive fish and plants are built to exploit. Which brings every thread in this story to a collision that is happening right now, in real time, in a river system still finding its new equilibrium. Salmon are pushing north into water they haven't touched in a century, exactly as biologists hoped. At the same time, a parasite that spent decades breeding in stagnant reservoirs is following the same current, no longer contained behind a wall of concrete. Communities that lost their lakeside homes are still fighting for compensation, while conservationists call the same event the greatest river restoration success in American history. Farmers upstream who depend on irrigation water are watching tribes and environmental groups push for even more water to stay in the river, setting up the next fight before this one has even finished playing out. And two dams still stand between these record-breaking salmon runs and the ancestral spawning grounds their entire migration was built around reaching. Nobody knows exactly how this settles. Does the parasite spread faster than the salmon can rebuild resistance to it? Do Kino and Link River come down next, or do they stay, permanently capping how far this recovery can go? Does the sediment finish flushing out clean, the way scientists promised, or does the damage prove more permanent than anyone in the celebration wanted to admit? And after 2 decades of tribes fighting for a river most of the country had forgotten existed, does the Klamath actually get to become what it was before any of this started, or does it settle into something new, something neither fully broken nor fully restored? That is the aftermath the cameras revealed. Not a clean ending, not a disaster either, something stranger than both. A century of damage undone in under 2 years, racing against a threat that same century of damage left behind. So what happens next? Does the Klamath finish healing, or does the parasite catch up to the salmon first? Do the last 2 dams come down, or is this recovery about to hit a wall it can't swim past? Drop your prediction in the comments. Full recovery, permanent damage, or somewhere in between neither side saw coming. Hit subscribe now. This river isn't finished telling its story. We're just getting started.